Welcome to the Create Your Story podcast, with conversations on creativity, self-leadership and personality to inspire and support your wholehearted life. I'm Terry Conlon, author, creative transition coach, teacher and personality type practitioner. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to pay my respects to the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land where I'm recording this podcast, and extend that respect to the traditional owners of lands across Australia and to elders, past, present and emerging. You can find the episode show notes, your free copy of Chapter 1 of my book, Wholehearted, Self-Leadership for Women in Transition, and lots more information at quietwriting.com. Now settle back and enjoy today's show. Welcome to episode 15 of the Create Your Story podcast, and it's 19th of April as I record this. I'm excited to have Sue Blair, personality type coach and educator, speaker, author, and fabulous resource creator, joining us today for the podcast. More on Sue and our conversation together in a moment. First, I want to share a personal update and an exciting new program open for enrolment now. I've been busy shaping up the Writing Road Trip community writing program I'm leading with my writing partner, Beth Cregan. We kick off on the 2nd of May for 6 months of writing together, and enrolment is open now if you want to join in. And there's an early bird, 10% off before the 21st of April at 9 o'clock in the morning, AEST, Sydney time. So if you're listening before then, do take advantage of that offer. The Writing Road Trip focuses on accountability, community, and support to help you write what's in your heart with the companionship of others. We've shaped up a program based on what worked to help us write our books, and we know it will help you with your writing practice. Plus, we'll have a ton of fun along the way. You can find out more about the Writing Road Trip via the link in the show notes. Now, on today's conversation with Sue Blair. Sue has been working with psychological type for 20 years. She is an international presenter and keynote speaker, as well as a qualified MBTI practitioner and adult educator. Sue is the author of the Personality Puzzle coaching cards, now used worldwide by coaches and counsellors. She has taught thousands of teachers, parents, students, and businesses about the importance of self-awareness and communication. And Sue is a recipient of the APTi, Association for Psychological Type International 2015 Gordon Lawrence Award, which recognises an outstanding achievement to the field of education. Sue and I met as fellow psychological type practitioners through the Australian Association for Psychological Type. New Zealand-based, Sue is a valuable and sought-after contributor to international conferences and forums on psychological type. I've had the pleasure of attending several workshops and conference presentations led by Sue. They're always immense fun and incredibly practical. Sue's teaching and sharing about personality type is characterised by strong roots in educational work, use of images and graphics such as through her personality puzzle coaching cards, and stunningly clear descriptions about personality type. And with more than 20 years experience in the field, all her work is enriched by deep knowledge. Sue has ESTJ preferences, so is extroverted and sensing in preference. And with quite a few introverts and intuitives like me on the show so far, I was super keen to explore different preferences in conversations with our guests and particularly with Sue. So we focus on this and on personality preferences generally and how they play out in practice to value difference in all kinds of ways in this episode. I hope it inspires you to explore more about personality insights and how they can help you with self-leadership and self-knowledge. So let's head into the interview with Sue. Hello, Sue, and welcome to the Create Your Story podcast.
Hi, Terry. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you for your connection, and I can't wait to explore more about you and about psychological type today. So we've connected in many ways around personality and psychological type as part of AUSAPT, the Australian Association for Psychological Type, and the global type community, and it's great to be able to share those conversations. So can you provide a brief overview about your background, how you got to be where you are, and the work that you do now?
Yes, absolutely. So way back a while ago, I was born in London. I am the youngest of 5 children. And we'll come on to this later, but I am the only extrovert in the whole family. I have a twin sister who is my absolute opposite in type. My preferences are ESTJ. My lovely twin sister is INFP. I started out business-wise in the travel industry and really enjoyed it. That's something that came very easily to me. I worked in business travel. It seemed to suit all of my requirements, meet my needs. Got into management and into sales and was a sales manager for quite a while before I then stopped to have children. So I met and married my lovely husband, John, who has ENTP preferences. We actually met commuting on the underground. Clearly, being an ENTP, he wasn't following any of the rules that you don't speak to anybody on the underground. And somehow or other, we got to be married, and 33 years later, we still are. So it's always an interesting experience to marry someone who's totally your opposite, but a good learning opportunity, I think. So we moved to New Zealand 25 years ago. I moved with an 18-month-old and then had my son James here. So we have two children, Louisa, who has ISTJ preferences, and James, who is ENTP. So not a huge amount of diversity in the family, but my goodness, parenting those two incredibly different children was what really got me into psychological type. I found out about it through doing a parenting course when I was in New Zealand, and it completely resonated with me. And I kind of got, well, would obsessed be the right word? I'm not entirely sure, but I just thought this is the most helpful thing that I have ever discovered about parenting. And it's so clear to me that I had these two children who were different. And if I parented them the same, then things were going to go downhill rather quickly. So Louisa, unsurprisingly, was somewhat more like me, although that difference between extroversion and introversion was very clear from the outset. And then parenting James, I just had to learn a whole new set of skills. And so getting them through the school system was also very, very different. Louisa was born for school. She accelerated herself. She was just like a pig in mud, really. She was happy other than socially. Sometimes she found it difficult. And James was just a square peg in a round hole. And we just had to get him through those 13 years until he exited and is now doing very well, thankfully. But it was that experience, that personal experience, that really introduced me to type. And I can remember going to a workshop, a Myers-Briggs workshop, and listening to a lovely woman presenting on type and just sitting there going, I want to do what she's doing. Mm-hmm. And eventually I did get to do that, but not necessarily in the corporate world. Yes, I have gone back to the corporate world and done a lot of work with teams, and that's a place that I feel very happy. But I really did want to use type to help parents, to help young people, to help teachers, to help educators, because it was really difficult. It was a real challenge to get an ENTP through school, my ENTP through school. And so really, I'd like to alleviate some of the headaches and just help people understand that people are going to learn differently. And that means that you can make that journey a lot easier. So I now work with teachers, with educators. I've done a lot of work with teenagers, helping them understand themselves. And more recently, working a lot with careers advisors in schools, because I really do believe that we've got a lot of young people who are making choices that are not as well informed as they could be. And so the work that I've been doing has been in educating the careers advisors within the school or university environment to say, include this. This is not the only thing that you need to know, but please include something on personality type so that the young people who you are working with get an understanding of themselves and why either a job environment might suit them or not, or why a particular career option that they're looking at might suit them or not. Bearing in mind that we're not matching a career with a type. We're not saying that people of this type can only do this sort of career. The world is your oyster in many, many ways, but it is absolutely necessary to see the essence of somebody and just say, let's just discuss this and maybe look at some other options. So it opens up the conversation as soon as a young person feels that they've got that self-awareness piece in mind.
That's fascinating. And it's always amazing to hear how people's life experiences have taken down a path and into their passions. And Your work really focuses in educational contexts, obviously from the experiences that you've been through, working with teachers, working with students, teenagers and careers advisors. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about this work and the value of type in these contexts? Because I'm sure there's just so much value for people in educational contexts.
Absolutely. I really love working with educators, and I've worked with them at all sorts of different levels, going from early childhood through primary through to high school. And in almost every setting, as soon as we start talking about personality type, they just look at me aghast and they just like saying, why did we not learn this at our teachers' education college? What was missing? This is an enormous piece of the puzzle that was missing. And I think they're absolutely right. It really is the case that you have to know the people who you are speaking to, or at least understand difference. So what we are not saying, obviously in a high school context, it gets even more difficult. At the younger years, it's a little bit easier. But we are not saying that you have to teach to everyone's personality type 100% of the time. But you have to offer choices within the classroom that is going to appeal to all students at some point in time. And it is definitely the case that they often learn most, in some cases, from doing something that doesn't fit their natural style. But unless they've got that knowledge that some of the time their needs are going to be met, then they can find the learning environment very difficult indeed. So it's a question of offering choices. What does that mean to both the educators and to the students? But also a lot of the time we're looking at team building within schools, because teachers work in clusters, and more now we have the modern learning environment. And that means that teachers are working very closely together. So I do work closely with my local primary school where both my children went to school. And they now have a modern learning environment where they've got 3 teachers who have 90 children for the year. And that means that it's far harder for them to know how the child is progressing all of the time. They can manage 30 children and they get to know them throughout the year. Really getting the same level of connection with 90 children is not that possible. And also to be able to connect well and work well with the other teachers who are working in that same situation. So how they get on, what their personalities are, how they can really leverage each other's strengths and understand that you don't have to be good at everything. You can have some gaps, you can have some holes, but if they work in a team where they've got multiple preferences, then you can really work together, everybody working to their strengths and everybody having a trust in each other that they can ask for help. And so I spend quite a lot of my time doing that as well. So it's not just how do you teach a child who's different to me, but how do we get on as adults? And also, how do we manage? One of the things that I find working in corporate life is that there are plenty of people who are given training on managing your staff, but nobody, or very rarely, are you given some training on how to manage up. How do you actually manage your boss? Because your boss is one of the most important peoples in your life. The person who is managing you, you need that connection to go well. So how does that look? And how can I make some changes? What sort of perspective shifts can I make in order to make that relationship work? And that's the same in schools or in corporates or in families.
Absolutely.
Everywhere you go, your personality is your permanent companion and you carry it with you wherever you go. So yeah, being able to cut and paste to different situations is really important.
Yes. Now, I've had the great opportunity of attending workshops with you and had so much value from those workshops, particularly where you've emphasised the 3 lenses of type, the idea of cognitive processes, temperament and interaction styles, and also the fantastic visual resources that you use. All of the things that you mentioned is about understanding ourselves, but it's how we work with others, how we work with our children, how we work with children as teachers, how we manage up, and absolutely that understanding your boss, understanding how your team works. All of those are just such critical life skills. I agree. Why did we not learn this is absolutely a question I've asked myself too. So, and you also said early on that it's like a piece of the puzzle missing. Is that why you called your cards personality puzzle?
I guess it was in a way, other than there's a beautiful alliteration, having personality puzzles. But, while I was sort of thinking about names and I was like puzzling it through and I was thinking, okay, yeah, this seems like a good way to go, because it is. Every family unit is different. Every working unit is different. And I've been doing this work for nearly 20 years plus, and I'm not bored with it yet because there's always a different puzzle. There's always something else that you haven't sort of considered. So yeah, probably.
Yeah, and I had a chat with Joe Arrigo, who I know you also know recently, and he talked about in coaching, he sees personality as a puzzle. He said not to be solved, but a puzzle to sort of put the pieces together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there those 3 lenses, which I think are invaluable. So having the cognitive processes, temperament and interaction styles, I consider them as being a bit like spinning plates. When I'm doing some coaching with somebody, I'm like, have I twizzled that plate? Have I gone through all 3? And you're just gathering the information and then coaching in relation to what you're hearing, but definitely using those 3 elements of type, those 3 perspectives, I find incredibly helpful.
They're so valuable. So how would you describe your signature style in your personality type work?
I often use a word that I kind of made up, which is Simplexity. And I rather like it because it really, I think, puts across the fact that we have to make things simple. If we're going to get to speak to people who are not type practitioners, then we have to make it as simple as possible. But I certainly want to honor the complexity of the model. We are all very complex people. We are all this dynamic and incredible mixture of physics, chemistry, and biology. We are complex human beings. The human brain is the most complex thing on the planet, so many people say. But trying to make it simple, I think as an ESTJ, my type preferences are pretty unusual in the type community. When I go to type conferences, probably 10 or 20% of people have a sensing preference. And I love hanging out with you intuiting guys. I think you're fabulous. I love the way that you think about things and you explore and you're so curious about everything. But my goodness, you can make things complicated from time to time. So I think my role within the type community is one that can just get through some of that, make things more simple, use a process to help people understand that involves grounded descriptions, communication style that is perhaps more direct, and getting to the point quickly, because we haven't got time. We are all time poor. So the more we can make the most of the time, then hopefully I provide resources that allow people to do that.
Oh, you absolutely do. And I mentioned your personality puzzle and type trilogy cards, as we've talked, and they're fantastic resources because they're very visual and they do make the complex clearer. And when I'm coaching, if I'm working with a client, I grab those cards and I have them around me as resources to prompt me, which I find really helpful. And they're great. And your LinkedIn posts that you've done recently are just fabulous. You look like you're really enjoying that social media work.
For the first time in my life, I can actually say that I am enjoying social media. And I have to thank Joe Arrigo for that, who got me onto it, because I was just wondering, what do you do with this? How do you communicate with the world about something that you find that's so important without kind of being too salesy? And he's really got me into this frame of mind that you just share what you know. And I've just been really happy doing that. I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. I might mention a few things that I'm involved with, but after 20 years of trying to put across this message on type, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, and I've just thoroughly enjoyed on a weekly basis putting some information out there that has been, something that I've learned along the way. And I've been to dozens of type conferences by now, which are all fantastic. I enjoy them. If I come away with 3 or 4 things that I've learned that I can describe a bit differently, then it's just a wonderful experience. And just being with a whole group of type enthusiasts is fantastic. So I've just thoroughly enjoyed sharing that and getting the comments back. It's been a joy and a pleasure, I have to say.
Yeah, it's been really well received. So you have preferences for extroversion. Can you explain what this means in practice and how it plays out in your life?
Absolutely. I think it certainly was striking. As I mentioned to you before, I come from a largish family. There's 5 children and my 2 parents, and I am the only extrovert in the family. I'm in my 50s now, but it was just a few years ago that my mum said to me, that must have been quite difficult for you. Yeah, it really was. I went out a lot. I had a fairly quiet sort of cerebral household that I came back to, and I'd walk through the door and go, "Woo, I'm home." And there was this sort of collective rolling of eyes. Yeah, you came through the door and the rest of us knew about it. So that's been interesting. And also raising a highly introverted child. My daughter Louisa has been a really interesting experience too. And as I mentioned again before, my twin sister has preferences for introversion. So how it plays out in my life is it didn't take me long to realize that I needed that need met hugely. I think it allows me to understand that that is not something that I can let go of, that I do need to communicate with other people. I do need connection with other people. And I've needed it all my life. This is something that has never changed. Even though I'm working from home a lot, sometimes I'm working by myself, I do organize my day so that I can get that need met in any way that I can. Often it is just going for walks. It's just connecting out with people. If I look over my week, I've got meetings, I've got people I'm seeing, I've got things I'm doing. And, there's wonderful occasions where I'm doing workshops, which is fantastic. I get my tank filled on a regular basis, but I understand it. I think I've also got a bit of a handle on when I'm too much for someone. I do sort of have this understanding that there are times when I need to sort of stop now and just quieten down a bit. When I go to see my sister, it's quite funny. She's an INFP, her partner is an INTP, and they have a lovely quiet life together in a very small village in England. And I stayed with them for a week, and I think I knew more people in the village at the end of the week than they'd known living there for 3 years. But they're also very appreciative of my need, and they love me arriving. But I'm pretty sure when I go, they go, "Ooh, well, we got through that little sort of hurricane that just came through our house."
So it must have been difficult as a person with extroverted preferences over the past 2 years with COVID impacts. So how was that for you, and how did Type Insights help you navigate these times?
Oh, I think I have never been more thankful for understanding Type. So my situation was possibly somewhat extreme in many ways. So I visited my elderly parents who both live on the small island of Alderney in the Channel Islands, which is an English-owned island, but just off the coast of France. And I was visiting my parents who were in their 90s. This was in March of 2020, and basically I got stuck there. So they needed some assistance at the time, and we got to the point where COVID was shutting everything down. And in New Zealand, either you got back by the 31st of March or you had no idea how long you'd be away for. The whole place was sort of shutting. And it wasn't possible for me to leave. My parents needed me at that point in time. And so I said, I can't go, I'll have to stay here. Anyway, I was on the island for 5 months. So this was tricky in many ways. I didn't have my usual routine. I didn't have structure. In fact, out of any of the needs that you can possibly think of that an ESTJ might need, absolutely all of them were taken away. So I couldn't work at pace. I couldn't be productive doing my own work. I was looking after my parents. And I have to say, I do adore my parents. The pace was glacial. It was so slow.
And it's not a big island, is it?
It's a very, very small island. And I walked every single inch of it. I paced around the island every afternoon while they were resting. And yeah, it was a difficult time. Not only that, but I had no idea what my future was as far as when I'd be able to leave. Would I be there for months? Would I be there for years? This was the time we had no vaccines. We had no idea how long this was going to be going on for. So nothing was available that gave me any sort of security. It was an extremely difficult time. But again, understanding Type, I got my needs met. I got involved with the Type community who were fabulous as support people. I went walking on the island every day and found a lovely lady who I'm still friendly with today. And we used to go walking literally for hours at 2:00 every afternoon. So I could do everything that I needed to do at my parents' place. And then I had this lovely person to go walking with for 2 hours every day. And we did. We just walked for miles and miles and miles. And so we were definitely therapy for each other. So that was great. But I knew what was difficult. I knew what I needed to do to try and cope with it. Certainly my experience wasn't worst experience in the COVID scenario. We were all well and COVID didn't hit the island very badly at all. And so we were fine, we were safe. So that was one of the things, one of my core needs was met, but challenging in many ways. Yeah. And even recently in 2021, just last year, my city, Auckland, was locked down for 100 days. And again, sometimes you feel you've pivoted so much, you're pirouetting around the place. But by then I was back at home, so that was a little bit easier. So I'd have more of my normal things around me. Yeah, but definitely, I think I would pull the strings on extroversion far more than perhaps the introverts. And again, my twin sister was gleeful
Yes, we're both introverts in our house and we've been quite happily ensconced.
She was completely content. It was almost like her whole life had been validated. Stay in. Thank you. Yeah. Work by yourself. Again, tick. So everything she needed was provided and everything I needed sort of wasn't.
Yeah. It must have been super challenging. So what would you say are some of the common misconceptions about extroversion and introversion?
I think the key one is this idea that extroverts are always sociable and introverts are always shy. Obviously, we each need to have a little bit of our other preference. There are times when I certainly enjoy my sociability. I really enjoy connecting with other people. It's something that I sort of like about myself. But I need time by myself, heavens. I really do, but not as much. I think there is a time and energy component to both of those preferences. Those with a preference for introversion, again, then they're not always shy. I know introverts who say to me that they don't have a shy bone in their body, and I believe them. I really do. But they need an exit strategy for when things become a little bit overwhelming, and they can get overwhelmed by a social event way more quickly than I can. So I think for extroverts, we don't need to conserve our energy in the same way that introverts do. You know, we get our energy from being out and about. It is exhausting for somebody with a preference for extroversion to spend all day by themselves, in the same way that it is exhausting for somebody with a preference for introversion to be out connecting all day. You know, you need a break after that. We need a break after having time by ourselves. So that time and energy component, I think, is really, really important. And I think it is the most misunderstood thing about extroverts and introverts. You know, we are not all one and none of the other. We are a lovely combo.
Yeah. And you explained that beautifully in your recent LinkedIn post, which I'll link to in the show notes, about solar versus battery energy. Yes. That was a beautiful analogy.
Yeah. Extroverts are solar powered. We literally do just get our energy back from being out there in the world. And that battery power, that resource, that inner resource that you go into, that introspection that you get your energy back from, is very different. And understanding that, appreciating that with the people we live with, the people we're raising, the people we work with, in all contexts.
Just as in the renewable energy world, we need both of those aspects of energy. We need both those in our community. So that's a great analogy. You have preferences for sensing also as opposed to intuiting. And this is probably one of the aspects of type that are perhaps harder to understand, I think, than some of the others. Yeah. So can you explain these preferences, sensing and intuiting, for gathering information in different ways?
Sure. I think if you have a sensing preference, that your mind is far more converging than it is diverging. You think of an idea and you zero in on it. If you think about going into Zoom and you're looking on Zoom and then you zoom in further and you zoom in further and you zoom in further, and you go, aha, that's where I need to go. The sensing brain does that naturally, whereas the intuiting brain is very much more divergent. It just has this natural outwards curiosity to it. So the sensing brain looks at the real, looks at the tangible, looks at what is, and really has a joy of that. And the intuiting brain looks at the possible, looks at the patterns, looks at what could be. And I'm often talking to people about creativity, because some people seem to think that those with an intuiting preference have sort of got a monopoly on creativity. And that isn't the case at all. Those with a sensing preference can really have a huge amount of creativity within them, but they use reality as a springboard to go to these different places. But let's gather the information first, and then we could just launch ourselves off into all sorts of different spaces. But ground me first. And those with an intuiting preference, the imagination is the tool that they use by which they can craft their reality and know what to do next. So it's sort of going outwards for those who have a sensing preference, from base upwards and outwards. And it's the opposite way for those with an intuiting preference. You just see that sort of big picture, and then you just wriggle that around in your mind to get to, okay, so what does that mean right now? Diverge, converge. Yeah.
Yes, I can certainly relate to that with my partner. Keith is ISTJ, so he has sensing preferences and I have intuiting. And the times I notice it is when he'll ask me a question, and then I will tell him all these different things that relate to it. And he'll say, no, I just asked you this question. And I think, I answered it. I just went through. But it's that meandering that to me is obvious. Like that relates to that. Whereas he goes, no, I just want this fact.
Yeah. And also I think the surprising thing for those of us who have a sensing preference is how many different interpretations you can make from one single sentence. You know, it's just, I didn't mean that. It's what I meant was, and it can be misinterpreted to like, you can get 10 different things out of one simple sentence.
So there's probably a lot of argument for intuitives working with sensing coaches, isn't there, and the opposite way around?
I think so, yes. I think often about the sort of coach who I would go to. There would be no point me going to a coach who have my preferences. I probably enjoy it. We probably have a marvelous time. Why go to another ESTJ or ISTJ? I can ESTJ somebody out of the park. I need to have another perspective.
Yes.
And perhaps that's why a lot of people who have my opposite preferences, because I think there's some statistics around that the people with intuiting and feeling preferences and sensing and feeling preferences are the most likely people to require or to go towards having coaching. Maybe an ESTJ perspective can be really helpful, as indeed I find intuiting preferences really helpful in coaching. Let's go and talk to somebody that just has a different view, because I don't want to hear the same thing again. I want to see what I'm missing. And although I can do it by myself, under stress, we do tend to exaggerate our natural preference. And so we can kind of block out and have blind spots to some of those areas that aren't as easily available to us. So yes, I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, interesting point. You mentioned creativity, and one thing I've noticed is that a lot of creatives and writers that I work with, they're often intuitive in preference. And when I talk about sensing and intuiting, they often find it hard to understand that they're not sensing in preference, because I guess perhaps writers, they see themselves working with the five senses and noticing what's around them. What would you say to that? It's just an interesting conundrum.
Yes, I think it is. And I think when you're looking at type, you have to really differentiate between what is being human and what is type. Where is the line there? And there are a lot of people who I speak to who say, well, I use sensing. I love going for walks in nature and I love enjoying all of the beauty of the things around me. I say, yeah, but that's being human. That's not type. When you have some information that you need, when you have got a problem to solve, where do you go to? And that's where your type difference comes in. So I think there's definitely that distinction to draw. What is human and what is psychological type? Yeah. And I think if those with an intuiting preference didn't use sensing, well, they'd be bumping into things all the time. You've got all of your senses and you're going to use them. Those with an intuiting preference absolutely do that. Those with a sensing preference still do have an imagination. We are very skilled with our imagination. We just use it at different times and in different ways.
So yeah, it's about what your preference is, what you go to perhaps first or naturally.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine who has INTP preferences, and she says, I am so in my head that I do bump into things from time to time. She's saying, I don't just bump into something that is surprisingly there. She says, I bump into my kitchen table, which hasn't moved for years. I've just got myself inside my head thinking something through, and I literally don't notice. I'm not aware of what's going on. That does happen also.
Yeah, and I often say that to clients who are similar types to me, like that introverted, intuitive, dominant. I have to actually make myself leave this room because, I've got all my resources, my imagination, my whole world's in this room. And I actually have to lever myself to go out and go for a walk on the beach. And when I do, it's the best thing in the world because I get that balance that I need.
Absolutely. And I really think that knowing type, you can be intentional about using these other preferences. And I think that's really important because you do need to recognize your blind spots and just go, what am I missing here? And that's an important conversation to have for everybody, to know what your strengths are. And sometimes your superpower is to understand your flaws and not be frightened of them. I can't do that. Yeah. But that doesn't worry me. I'm okay. I will either get some support in this area or I will kind of intentionally force my brain to just ask a few questions that I wouldn't normally ask. Think outside the box. What am I missing here? Is there an elephant in the room? Is there something I haven't noticed? And sort of direct your attention in a different way, which is a lot easier to do when you're not stressed.
That's for sure. Yeah, and I love your writing and insights on the inferior function, which is in part what we're talking about here, that real opposite of our dominant preference. So can you explain a little bit about the inferior function and why people might choose to work with it as a form of self-awareness and growth?
Yeah, actually it's a good segue having had that conversation just now, really, because I think, in my view, the inferior function would be better if we reframed it and retitled it. I think it isn't actually inferior. I call it the balancing function. We all need to have a balance. Some of the images that I put across when I'm doing workshops is that I have the image of a horse that's got out of control. When your dominant function runs away with you, you literally can't put brakes on it. But neither are we going to trot perfectly around a dressage arena and get our sort of extended trots working smoothly. Life isn't like that. We're not going to do things perfectly. So we are going to have to rumble with things, and we will just maintain as much control as we possibly can. So I think that's what the inferior function allows us to do. It just reins us in from making some stupid mistakes, from just letting the whole thing get out of control, and try and engage with it rather than ignore it completely, which is going to send us off in the wrong direction. So in fact, the presentation that I'll be doing for BAPS is called Type in Tandem. And that's really thinking about what is it like to ride a tandem bicycle? You've got somebody on the front, you've got somebody at the back. If you think about that as your dominant inferior function, if the only person that's working is the person who's at the front, who's got the steering wheel and who's driving everything, but is not getting any power from the back, then it's just hard work. You need to have that person on the back. You need to have like this psychotherapist that's tapping you on the shoulder that's going, excuse me, have you thought about this? Let me help you with that. And that combination of types can be really great. So with my preferences, for example, as ISTJ, my dominant function, extroverted thinking, it needs introverted feeling to say, is this important? Does this really matter? Is the energy that you're putting into this activity worthy? Is it something that is going to produce good results? Not is it necessarily going to give you happiness, but is what you are doing going to make you happier than you were? Are you working towards something that's meaningful and important to you? And I do really find that certainly in my later years, I've been able to tap into that. Similarly, as I've mentioned, my lovely sister has an INFP preferences. She works the other way around. She actually is an artist. She does beautiful work. She does work that is meaningful to her, and her values are strong. But if you just sit with strong values and do nothing with them, then that's not a life well led either. So she needs to take those inner values and those inner core resources that she absolutely has in spades and just say, okay, so now what am I going to do with this? What am I going to put out to the world? Because that doesn't need to stay within me. I need to put something out into the world so that I have this legacy that I believe in and is strong within me. And you can use extroverted thinking to do that. How am I going to organize my life so that the introverted feeling that is key for me has an external expression that is helpful to others. So the inferior function can just be incredible. It can be incredibly powerful, and it can also be very, very difficult if you have no access to it whatsoever. We need to have those functions, whatever is your dominant and inferior function. They do need to be working in cahoots. They need to understand each other and tap in and say, hello, what advice can you give me on this one?
Yeah, I love that article that you wrote for BAPT a little while ago. And again, I'll link to it in the show notes on the inferior function. And for each function, you've got a lovely question, just as you've shown us in those examples of if you're really strong on this function, how to bring in the opposite through just asking a question. Certainly for my type, that question was like, oh, it just takes you back because it's completely where you need to be focusing, but it's not in your consciousness.
Absolutely. And I think we can all have even a list of questions available to us before we're decision making. Certainly, your dominant function is the one that I really fail to get most of the time. That future thinking. Looking back in my past, I would take my life one term at a time. When I had children, 1 year at a time was the maximum I'd look out. To actually go to the top of the mountain and look any further is really difficult for me. And for anybody who's saying, well, what's your 5 or 10 year plan? It's like, I have absolutely no idea. But in fact, it's probably a good idea to look 5 and 10 years ahead. What you're doing now could be really relevant to what you might need to be doing in 5 or 10 years' time. But it just simply doesn't occur to me to go and do that. So I need to be dragged kicking and screaming into your head, Terry, so that you can tell me a few things.
Must be great having a twin who's your exact opposite in terms of the types.
Yes, it's got better and better as we've got older, as you can imagine, through our younger and teenage years. There were some tricky patches, but I think we've forgiven each other. I think she had to forgive me for a whole lot more than I had to forgive her, to be honest. But we've absolutely worked it out. But I would highly recommend anybody who understands type and who knows their type preferences to find somebody who is their complete opposite and just build a connection so that you can just link in with each other and say, I'm thinking like this. Can you help me out with that?
That's a great idea.
Link up with someone who's your opposite. So you'll have to find an ESFP, Terry.
I will, yeah. So the last couple of questions are questions that I ask each guest on the podcast. Because it's the Create Your Story podcast, interested in how you have created your story over your lifetime. It's a big question, but interested to see what pops up.
If I look back over my life, I can really see my type preferences being in action from the early years, as you can imagine. I think what understanding type has really given me as an adult is it has absolutely allowed me to make sure that I'm doing work that uses my strengths and that there are some things that I can't do. So if you're waiting at a bus stop and several buses come along, there's been several buses in my life that with my type knowledge, I've gone, that one's not for me. I can do this, but this one I can't. And then my bus comes along and I go, no, that one I can do. Yeah, that one's for me. And to not be anxious or worried about it. So I've found that increasingly helpful as I've gone through the years, being able to adjust and use the skills that I have in a way that I know is going to enable me to give my best to the world. We were saying earlier about my role in type is to take the complication out of things, make things simple and communicate it as clearly and concisely as I possibly can so that people get it first time. They're not just struggling and having things ramble around in their minds, giving them something that's concrete. And so I feel like I'm able to do that. Even with the personality puzzles, I had a prototype of the personality puzzles when I first went on my certification program. So before I even been certified to use type, I realized that I needed a tool, a resource to help me talk to people about it so that they could understand it clearly and I could get that information back. So I think that has definitely assisted me. And I think it will assist me still going forward. So creating my story, I think it also enables you to be happy with the story that you've got. I'm happy with the fact that there are some things that I can't do. I really admire people who have different talent to me. I think it's allowed me to not be so swift, to step back and watch and enjoy people having other talents without feeling envious of them or wishing that I had them, those sorts of feelings, and just being a lot more comfortable in myself. It's just helped enormously.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you with that type's been such a huge part of your story as it's evolved. And it sounds like it's been a real tool for wisdom.
I hope so. It definitely has given me other perspectives. One of the things that I really like when I'm writing, I've done, as you know, several resources and I write type descriptions. And they're not easy to write, especially when you've only got an A5 piece of card in which to put as much information as you possibly can about a particular type. And my modus operandi for doing that was to literally sink myself into each of the 16 types while I was writing about INTJ or ESFP or whichever one. And it would be quite a task in any given morning that I knew I would be doing some writing. I just go, now, which one do I want to be today? And then just immersing myself in this sort of ENTP brain of like, well, okay, let me be this for a day or 2 days. And just thoroughly enjoying it, being able to glean so much from not only the other type descriptions that you're reading, but just to create something that is different and valuable that people are going to get in just by reading those type descriptions. It's a very therapeutic way of doing it and an interesting dive into being someone else for a while. I guess actors do that a lot with their characters. I can't claim to have any acting skills whatsoever. I imagine it's a similar process that you cloak yourself in someone else for a while and then you can shed it. It's fascinating. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and it must have been amazing working through all 16 types. I've had a taste of it with doing workshops with Dario Nardi with his priming, where you put yourself into exactly what it's like. I work particularly on INTP, and just putting myself in the shoe and working with an INTP as a partner in that exercise made me realise how different life is, and running so many processes in your mind as an INTP typically does all the time is incredibly cognitively busy.
Yeah. One of the sensing activities that I do in workshops is that I literally have different coloured acetates, blues, greens, yellows, and I just get people to hold them up to their eyes and just say, well, looking through the red acetate looks like this, and now change to yellow or change to blue or change to green. And it's as different as that. People just see their world with totally different filters. And unless you know about it, then you can't be aware of it. But once you know about it, you will never not know it. And that's the beauty of understanding type. You will never go through life not knowing this information. And I think it's a gift, really. It's gold in people's lives.
Yeah, and I think that's why so many of us who work in type have chosen to do that, just as you've explained. Once you learn the value of it for yourself, but also working with others, it is really gold. And as you were talking there, it sounded like type was like a framework for choices, for discernment too, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So in Wholehearted, my book, I have 15 wholehearted self-leadership skills and practices for women. And to add to that body of knowledge, I'm interested in your top wholehearted self-leadership practices, especially for women.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think one of the things over the years that I have come to really want to reframe in people's minds is this imposter syndrome. People are talking about imposter syndrome a lot at the moment, and I'm not too sure that it's helpful. I think that both men and women do get it, but I think women may have it more obviously or more often. I haven't got any research for that, but in my knowledge of in the work that I've been doing. And I kind of like to reframe it because I think that it is absolutely necessary to have a reasonable and realistic doubt about some of the challenges that you might take on. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a syndrome. You are not an imposter. You just have some reasonable doubt. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're not going to take on the challenge. So instead of saying, well, I've got imposter syndrome, I'm terribly worried about it and I might not do it. Why am I here? Okay, I've got some reasonable doubt, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I think that's a far better way to look at it because we all have some doubts along the way. And I remember going to a conference for careers advisors, and they said that the research there is that before women apply for a promotion or a new job, it is very likely, more likely than with men, for them to think, well, I haven't got some of the things that this job description is requiring, so I won't apply until I have consolidated and done an extra course or done another 2 years or built up my skills so that I can apply for the job. And men tend not to do that. They tend to tick 50% or 60% of the boxes. So, well, I'll just give it a go. And I think we need to do that as women a bit more often and to stop consolidating and thinking, yes, I need to do this, and this before I can do that. Just, yeah, it could be a challenge. You may have some reasonable and rational doubts, but do it anyway. I know that there is that book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, but it's experience the doubt that's reasonable and rational and do it anyway.
That's a great top tip. A coach that I trained with a little while ago, he stressed the importance of not waiting until you're free of fear or free of doubt, but to move ahead with those because he said they'll always be there with you. And if you wait until you're free of doubt or fear, you'll never move. And
get support. I love the work of Brené Brown, and she talks about vulnerability. And it's okay to have that vulnerability. It absolutely is. We need to shift this idea that we may have in our heads about leadership that means that we don't need to be vulnerable. You know, we're going to make mistakes, and failure we learn from and grow from. We don't want to make huge mistakes, but we don't want the fear of it to stop us doing something. And so saying to yourself, this is a reasonable and realistic doubt, but let me just go ahead and just give it my best shot.
I love that. It's a great thing to remember. So we're just about at the end of our time together. So thanks so much for joining me today, Sue. It's been great to learn more about you and to chat more about type and through all different aspects of how type can be such a powerful framework for us in guiding our lives. So where can people find out more about you and your work online?
Oh, thank you. So I've got a couple of websites, one of them for my resources, which is personalitypuzzles.com. And then for the coaching work and the presentation work that I do is sueblair.co.nz, or in fact, personalitydynamics.co.nz. Either one will get you there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been wonderful.
You're very welcome, Terry. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening today, and I hope you found it inspiring and supportive. You can find the episode show notes, get your free copy of Chapter 1 of Wholehearted, and find out more about my books, coaching, and other offerings at quietwriting.com. Connect with me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where I am at Writing Quietly. Please leave a review on your favourite podcast app too to help others find the show and create their story. And warmest wishes for you as you create your story in the world.